California is the third largest state in America, 163,000 square miles of coastline, mountain ranges, desert basins, and the most productive farmland on Earth. But nearly half that land belongs to the federal government. Another 40% is agriculture. Most of what remains is desert or mountains too steep to build on. When you subtract everything people cannot use, California stops looking like the biggest state in the West and starts looking like one of the most physically constrained places in the entire country. But that is not even the real problem. The real problem is what happens when 39 million people get funneled into that narrow remaining strip, and every direction they could expand is blocked by a different crisis. Start with the total, roughly 100 million acres of California. Now subtract the 48 million acres owned by the federal government. National forests, military installations, desert preserves, wilderness areas stretching from the Oregon border to the Mexican line. Subtract another 40 million acres locked in agriculture. Subtract the Sierra Nevada, a granite wall running 400 miles along the eastern border, its peaks climbing past 14,000 feet. Subtract the coast ranges cutting north to south through the state's midsection, blocking inland access from nearly every coastal city. Subtract the Mojave and Colorado deserts spreading across the southeast, where summer temperatures regularly exceed 120 degrees and the land drops below sea level at places like the Salton Sink. What remains for cities and suburbs is shockingly small, a fraction of the state's total area, most of it already built on. The Central Valley looks like an obvious answer. 450 miles long, flat, wide open. From the air, it seems like the most buildable land in the West. But that valley is the state's breadbasket, not its bedroom. It produces over $40 billion in crops annually, feeding not just California but a significant share of the entire country's fruit, vegetable, and nut supply. The valley consumes roughly 80% of California's developed water supply to do it. You cannot pave those fields without dismantling a food system that millions of Americans depend on. So where do people actually live? Over 70% of Californians are packed into coastal counties, pressed between the Pacific Ocean and the mountains. A narrow ribbon of habitable land stretched along the edge of a continent. Drive an hour inland from almost any coastal city and you hit terrain that fights back. Steep canyons, dry ridgelines, or federally protected wilderness where building is simply illegal. The US government has acknowledged the math plainly. Most of California's population is crowded into a small part of its territory, constricted by expanses of rugged topography and a widespread lack of water. This is the myth that needs to die first. The common belief that California is huge and just needs to change its zoning laws misses the fundamental constraint. Zoning is a policy. The mountains, the desert, and the federal boundaries are not. The land itself is the bottleneck. And even that narrow coastal strip where people can live only functions because of an engineering system that is now starting to fail. California's explosive 20th century growth rested on an engineering illusion. Move water from the wet north and the snowpack mountains to the dry cities and farms in the south. The Central Valley Project, the State Water Project, the Colorado River aqueducts. These massive systems turned deserts into suburbs and floodplains into the most productive farmland on Earth. The scale is staggering. The State Water Project alone pushes water nearly 450 miles from the Sacramento Delta to Southern California, lifting it 2,000 feet over the Tehachapi Mountains in the process, the highest single water lift on Earth. For decades, the illusion held. Water flowed uphill toward money, and California boomed. But the system was designed for a climate pattern that is now broken. The American West is in its driest 22-year stretch in at least 1,200 years. Sierra Snowpack, the state's natural reservoir, the frozen bank account that feeds rivers all summer long, is shrinking. In some years, the snowpack has dropped to less than 10% of its historical average. That is not a drought in the traditional sense. A drought implies the rain will come back. What climate scientists are describing is a permanent shift in baseline conditions. A new normal where the water California's infrastructure was engineered to capture simply does not fall from the sky in the quantities it once did. And here is the detail that should alarm anyone paying attention. more water is legally promised to users of the Colorado River than actually flows in it. That math does not work. Lake Mead's White Bathtub Ring, the chalky line on Red Canyon walls where the water used to reach, is the visible proof of a system running on overdraft. Lake Powell, the other giant reservoir in the system, has dropped to levels that threaten its ability to generate hydroelectric power. Water managers are not debating whether the system will face a reckoning. They are debating when. As one UCLA researcher put it, California's water system was built for a climate that no longer exists. The engineering that made the state possible is now the system most likely to fail. The coast is boxed in. The water is drying up. The obvious answer seems simple. Push people inland, into the hills, into the valleys, into the open spaces at the edge. But the edge has its own trap, and if you find this kind of geographic breakdown interesting, subscribe, because California is already falling into it. Because flat coastal land is scarce and expensive, development has crept steadily into the wildland-urban interface, the WUI, where housing meets flammable hillsides and canyons choked with dry brush. About a third of California's housing stock now sits in these high-risk fire zones. That is roughly 11 million people living where chaparral and eucalyptus grow right up against back fences. WUI housing grew approximately 40% between 1990 and 2020, and the expansion has not slowed. In some counties, the WUI is the only place where a middle-class family can afford to buy a home. This is not recklessness. It is geometry. When the coast is full, the valley is farmland, the desert is federal land, and water is vanishing, the only affordable acreage left is in the fire-prone hills. California's Santa Ana and Diablo winds, hot, dry gusts that can top 80 miles per hour, turn these landscapes into blowtorches every autumn. The 2018 Camp Fire destroyed roughly 18,800 structures and killed 86 people in Paradise, a WUI community built into steep, rugged terrain surrounded by dense forest. The fire moved so fast that residents had minutes, not hours, to evacuate on roads that were never designed for a mass exodus.
That's Laura's house.
Yep. That's Laura's house. Well, it's his house. It's burning.
The town was not careless. It was trapped by the same forces squeezing the rest of the state. The cruelest paradox comes after the flames go out. Most communities rebuild right back in the same canyons and foothills because the safer coastal core is unaffordable. Geography does not just create the fire risk, it removes the escape route. The housing crisis and the fire crisis are not two separate problems. They are the same crisis viewed from different angles. One pushes people outward, the other punishes them for going. The invisible hand is now doing what planners could not, pricing people out of the danger zones. State Farm and Allstate stopped writing new homeowner policies across much of California. Wildfire exposure and construction costs have made coverage uneconomic under current rules. Other insurers have followed or restricted coverage to the point where policies are functionally unavailable in high-risk areas. Homeowners who lose coverage get pushed to the state's insurer of last resort, the FAIR Plan, which was never designed to carry this many policies and charges premiums that can run 2 or 3 times what the private market once offered. This is not just an insurance story. It is the moment geography's constraints become financially visible. A house you cannot insure is a house you cannot mortgage. A house you cannot mortgage is a house that loses its value. Entire WUI communities now face a potential death spiral, uninsurable, unsellable, but also irreplaceable, because there is nowhere cheaper to go that is not also in a hazard zone. Families who bought homes in the foothills a decade ago, when insurance was still available and affordable, now find themselves trapped in properties they cannot protect and cannot leave. The market is drawing the same map the terrain drew millions of years ago. It is just using dollar signs instead of contour lines. So the coast is full, the water is failing, the hills are burning, and insurance companies are walking away. There is one last place California could theoretically expand, the Great Flat Central Valley. But what is happening there right now might be the most alarming development of all. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, passed in 2014, requires California's most overdrafted aquifers to reach balance by roughly 2040. The translation is stark. At least 500,000 to 1 million acres of San Joaquin Valley farmland will be permanently fallowed. That is not activist speculation. It is the state's own legal framework, signed into law and now being implemented basin by basin. And the land that comes out of production cannot simply become new suburbs. It often lacks surface water, sits in dust storm-prone terrain, and would lock more people into the most air-polluted, heat-exposed basins in the country. The Central Valley already has some of the worst air quality in the nation, ozone and particulate levels that regularly exceed federal standards. Valley fever outbreaks are rising as disturbed soil releases fungal spores into the wind. History offers a warning of what a drier, more exposed valley looks like. In 1977, the Great Bakersfield dust storm sent winds estimated near 190 miles per hour, tearing across the southern San Joaquin Valley. The sky turned opaque. Livestock were buried. Canal systems choked with debris. That was a preview, a single event in a valley that was still mostly irrigated and farmed. A future with hundreds of thousands of fallowed, unwatered acres invites that kind of devastation back on a regular basis. The obvious inland expansion does not solve the trap. It trades one crisis for three: dust storms, toxic air, and the same water scarcity that created the problem in the first place. Every escape hatch leads back into the cage. Everything discussed so far moves in slow motion. Decades of drought, years of sprawl, gradual insurance withdrawal. This one is instantaneous. The USGS puts the probability of a magnitude 6.7 or larger earthquake hitting California in the next 30 years at greater than 99%. There is roughly a 46% chance of a magnitude 7.5 or greater event. The San Andreas, Hayward, and associated fault systems run directly through or beneath the most densely populated, most economically productive, most geographically constrained corridor in the state. An earthquake does not care about housing policy or water rights. It simply tests whether the infrastructure built inside the trap can survive a sudden, violent shock. And the more people packed into that narrow coastal corridor, the corridor that geography forced them into, the higher the stakes when the ground starts moving. The 1994 Northridge earthquake caused an estimated $49 billion in damage, collapsed freeway overpasses, and left 20,000 people homeless. And it struck a 6.7 on the Richter scale in a single section of Los Angeles. The expected San Andreas rupture would release dozens of times more energy, shaking a population corridor that is far more densely built today than it was 30 years ago. Water mains, gas pipelines, freeway overpasses, and high-rise foundations would all be tested simultaneously across hundreds of miles. The same geographic funneling that concentrates California's population also concentrates its seismic exposure. The trap is not just tight, it is sitting on a fault line. Pull the camera back now and look at the full picture. Build more housing on the coast. There is no room. Push people inland. The water is disappearing and the air is toxic. Develop the hills. They burn. Retire farmland to free up water. Dust storms and lost food production follow. Densify the existing cities. Political resistance collides with earthquake vulnerability in an already constrained corridor. Import more water. The rivers are overallocated and the reservoirs are dropping. This is the structural conflict baked into the map. Geography ensures that solving any one of California's crises makes another one worse. Housing affordability, climate risk, water security, and food production are locked in a zero-sum cage match, and the cage is the terrain itself. Every proposed solution runs headlong into a constraint imposed by the land. Desalination could ease the water crisis, but the plants are expensive, energy-intensive, and can only be sited on the already overcrowded coast. Solar farms could power them, but the best solar land is in the desert, which is mostly federal. The math circles back on itself no matter which direction you push. The 20th century's three growth assumptions, that water could always be moved, that cheap edge land could absorb demand, and that climate extremes would stay manageable, have all broken simultaneously. California built a civilization on those assumptions. The geography is now calling in the debt. This is not a policy failure, it is a geographic inheritance. Come back to that satellite image of California at night. The blazing coastal strip, the dark interior. Now you understand what you are actually looking at. Not just where people live, but why they cannot live anywhere else. The lights are bright because the darkness around them is absolute. Mountains, desert, federal land, farmland, fire zones, fault lines. Every inch of that glowing strip is doing triple duty, housing people, sustaining an economy, and absorbing risks that have nowhere else to go. California did not choose to be constrained. The land chose it millions of years before anyone arrived. The most powerful economy, the most productive farmland, and the most desirable coastline in America, all funneled into a narrow corridor that is simultaneously running out of water, burning at the edges, shaking from below, and unable to expand. The state that represents the American dream of unlimited possibility is, geographically, one of the most limited places in the country. Thanks for watching. Check out the recommended videos on screen, and if you haven't already, subscribe.